I've been a seasonal field technician for going on 6 years now. Before that, I did 2 years as a trail maintenance volunteer, one summer as a fire lookout assistant in Oregon, and a brief, forgettable stint doing equipment inventory for a county parks department in central Washington. I'm not somebody who gets rattled easily by isolation. I actually prefer it. The quiet, the routine, the way a workday in a remote station has a shape to it that office jobs never quite manage. You know what you're doing at 7 in the morning. You know what you're doing at noon. You know what you're doing when the light drops and the temperature falls, and the only sound outside is wind moving through whatever kind of trees the posting put you near. I've slept alone in structures that most people would find deeply uncomfortable. Lookout towers with floors that flex when you walk on them. Maintenance sheds with broken locks and animal smells. Equipment depots that hadn't been properly occupied in years. None of that ever got to me. I always figured the discomfort people feel in isolated places is mostly a failure of imagination. They're filling the silence with things that aren't there. I used to think that. The posting that changed my thinking came through in late October. Northern Minnesota, a seasonal resource monitoring station about 11 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible by a logging track that turned to mud every time it rained and froze solid every time it didn't. The job was simple on paper. Occupy the station through the early winter months. Conduct weekly water quality readings at 4 designated creek sites. Log weather data twice daily. Maintain the equipment. Keep the cabin in operational condition. File digital reports when the satellite uplink was functional, which the pre-assignment documentation warned me would be irregular. The pay was good for what it was. Better than good, actually, which I noticed but didn't think too hard about. I needed the money. My truck needed a transmission, and I had 3 months of deferred dental work and an ex-wife whose support payments I was already behind on. And this posting came with housing included and a per diem that would let me bank almost everything I earned. That's the part they rely on, not just for me. I think that's always how these things work. You take the job because the numbers make sense and you don't ask enough questions about the specifics. The drive-in took most of a day. The last 2 hours on the logging track were slow going, even in dry conditions, and the trees came in close on both sides. Tall second-growth birch and aspen, with their leaves already gone by that point in October. The trunks pale and bare and crowded enough that looking into the woods felt like looking at something deliberately obscured. The station came into view just before dusk. It was smaller than the photos in the assignment packet had suggested. A main cabin structure, maybe 400 square feet, wood-sided and painted a dark green that had faded to something closer to gray. A separate equipment shed, a narrow covered porch, a generator housing on the north side of the structure. A single satellite dish mounted on a pole about 30 feet from the cabin. The cable running along the ground and in through a conduit near the base of the exterior wall. Inside, the cabin was standard, a sleeping area separated from the main room by a partial wall. A kitchen setup with a propane stove and a hand pump sink connected to a cistern. A wood stove in the corner. A work desk along the east wall with a mounted radio unit. A laptop docking station, and a single overhead light on a pull chain. And on the desk, when I arrived, a logbook. It was already there. Government issue, hardcover, dark green, about the dimensions of a standard composition notebook, but thicker. My name was on the front in a label printed from what looked like an office label maker. My full name, my employee ID number, and the station designation. The logbook being pre-labeled wasn't unusual. The assignment coordinator usually handles that. What I noticed, but didn't think much about at first, was that the book was not empty. The first 40 or so pages had already been filled in. I assumed it was from a previous occupant. The dates in the earlier entries went back about 3 months, which tracked with the standard seasonal rotation. The handwriting was neat and consistent. The entries brief and procedural, exactly the kind of logging I'd been trained to do. Weather readings, creek level notations, equipment status, nothing personal. I flipped through it out of professional habit, scanning for anything relevant to current conditions. Water table at Site 2 had been running high in September. The generator had a fuel filter that needed attention. The satellite uplink was unreliable between roughly 11 at night and 2 in the morning due to what a technician had apparently assessed as an atmospheric interference pattern specific to the station's geography. I noted all of that, made a mental note about the fuel filter, set the book on the desk, and started unloading my gear. The first week was exactly what I expected. Cold morning, slow routine, the particular silence of deep woods November that sits on the ears like pressure. I did my readings, maintained my equipment, filed my reports when the uplink cooperated. I started making entries in the logbook, beginning from the next blank page after the previous occupant's last entry. I wrote the way I always write in field logs: date at the top, time of observation, conditions, readings, equipment notes, brief and factual. The thing I'm going to describe happened for the first time on the 9th night of the posting. I was sitting at the desk around 10 in the evening. The logbook was open in front of me. I had just finished writing the day's second weather entry and was about to close the book when I noticed something in the entry below what I'd just written. There was a new line, in handwriting that was not mine. It said, Site 2 creek level rising, check by morning. I sat with that for a while, long enough that the wood stove burned down some before I thought to add a log. My first thought, the rational one, was that I hadn't noticed a second entry on the page, that I'd written my entry in a space where something already existed and simply hadn't registered it in low light. I told myself that. I believed it, mostly. I held the book under the overhead light and looked at the page carefully. The ink from my own entry was dry. The ink from that other line was dry. But the handwriting was different from mine. Different from the previous occupant's handwriting, too, which I compared directly by flipping back a few pages. Smaller letters, slightly different angle, a different kind of pen from the look of the stroke. I closed the book and went to bed. Site 2 was the one with the elevated water history. I told myself it was residual information from the earlier entries somewhere in my head, working itself out in a moment of low attention. I told myself I'd misread my own handwriting in the dark. I told myself a lot of things. In the morning, Site 2 was flooding, not dramatically. The creek had pushed over its eastern bank by about 2 feet overnight. I took my readings, logged the deviation, and hiked back to the cabin. When I opened the logbook to record the morning observations, I noticed that the line I'd seen the night before was gone. The page looked the way it should look. My entry, clean and complete, nothing below it. I checked the surrounding pages, nothing out of order. I sat down and wrote my morning entry, and when I finished, I sat looking at the page for a while. Then I made a second decision not to report it. I want to be honest about that. I had a satellite connection that morning, functional, and I could have filed a note with the regional coordinator describing what I'd seen. I didn't. Partly because I couldn't frame it in a way that would sound like anything other than fatigue or confusion. Partly because I needed this job. And partly, I think, because some part of me already understood on a very quiet level that whatever this was, it was not a mistake. The second incident came 6 nights later, Same desk, same time of evening, same setup. I had just written my night entry and was reading back through my work, which is a habit of mine, checking for errors before I close the book. And at the bottom of the page, below the last line I'd written, there were 2 new lines. Equipment shed door, left latch, check before weather comes in. And below that, storm system, 36 hours. I set down my pen. I looked at the handwriting. Same small, clean script as before. Different ink again, a slightly lighter blue than the government issue pen I was using. I looked at it for probably 2 full minutes. Then I got up, put on my coat, walked to the equipment shed, and checked the left latch. It was loose. The mounting screws had worked out of the wood over time, and the latch plate was only holding on one side. Another hard wind, and the door would have swung open and stayed open. I had supplies in that shed that could not get wet. I spent 40 minutes reinforcing the latch with longer screws from the hardware kit. The storm came, and 38 hours later. Not 36, but close enough that the difference felt like rounding. It dropped 8 inches of wet snow and drove the wind hard enough that the equipment shed door would absolutely have failed. After that, I stopped pretending I was confused. What I started doing instead was paying attention differently. I didn't stop using the logbook. I didn't request a new one. I didn't report anything. What I did was finish my entry for each day and then wait. Not for long, usually 10, 15 minutes. Sometimes the new lines appeared, sometimes they didn't. When they appeared, they were always in that same small handwriting, always practical, never explanatory, never conversational, just information. A note about the water pump intake, a note about a tree that was leaning toward the satellite cable, a note about ice formation at Site 3 that I should probe before stepping. A note about the generator's fuel consumption rate that turned out to be more accurate than the manual's estimate for cold weather operation. Every single note was correct, every single one. I started waiting for them. That's the part that bothers me when I think about it clearly. I would finish my entry, set down my pen, and wait. And during that waiting, there was something that I can only describe as anticipation. Not dread anymore. Not confusion. Anticipation. Like waiting for a colleague to respond to something you've left on their desk. Like the pause after you send a question and before the answer comes back. I started writing questions. Not directly. I didn't write "Who are you?" or "What is this?" I wrote my procedural entries the way I always had, but I started including uncertainty in them. Operational uncertainties. Things I genuinely didn't know. Fuel reserve estimate unclear. May need resupply before end of month. Site 4 readings inconsistent. Unclear if equipment issue or actual variation. And the entries that came back addressed those uncertainties. Not always fully. But they responded to what I'd written every time. There was a night in December when I came back from Site 1, reading in conditions that had deteriorated faster than predicted. I was cold and behind on my schedule, and I sat down and wrote my entry, and I was, I'll say it honestly, a little scared. The logging track had been icy, and I'd come close to losing the truck on a curve I knew well enough to be careless about. I wrote the entry, date, time, conditions, readings, and then at the bottom of my entry, before I'd put the pen down, I wrote something that wasn't procedural. I wrote, "It was close today." I don't know why. I think I just needed to write it somewhere. When I checked the page 10 minutes later, below my line, in that small handwriting, "Drive slower on the south curve. Ice forms there first." That was when I started feeling something I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't fear, or not primarily. It was something more like the feeling of being watched by something that is not hostile, being observed by a system that has requirements and is checking whether you meet them. Being incorporated. I started being more careful on the south curve. Around the third week of December, I did something I'm not entirely comfortable admitting. I started leaving the logbook open on the desk when I went to bed. I told myself this was practical, so the morning entry would be easy to start. But I think the real reason was that I wanted to see if anything appeared in it while I slept. The first morning I tried this, there were 3 lines on the page when I got up. 2 were operational, waterline insulation check, and a note about the propane connection that turned out to have a minor seepage issue I wouldn't have caught for weeks. The third line was different. It said, "You sleep too light. It will wear on you." I read that maybe 8 or 9 times. I looked at the handwriting. Same script, same instrument. I sat with my coffee and looked at it. Then I wrote my morning entry over it, which is what I'd been doing with all of them, writing my scheduled entry on the same page. And by the next time I looked, that line was gone the way they always went. But it had been accurate. I was sleeping badly, waking at 3, 4 in the morning for no reason I could identify, lying in the dark, listening to the cabin settle and the wind work at the roof. I'd been blaming the cold, the altitude, the isolation. But the note had said it plainly, and something about having it written down by an outside party made it feel more factual than a self-assessment would have. I started sleeping better after that, and I don't know if it was because I adjusted my habits or because something had shifted in how I understood my situation here. Probably both. I had one satellite call with the regional coordinator in mid-December, a routine check-in. She asked how operations were going. I said fine, everything on schedule. She asked if I had any issues to report. I told her about the latch repair and the propane connection, both of which I'd actually documented in my reports already. She confirmed she'd seen those entries and said good work. She didn't ask about the logbook. I didn't mention it. At one point in that conversation, she said something that stayed with me. She said the station had a good history of clean operational runs, that they always seemed to get strong field technicians out there. I asked how many previous occupants the station had had. She said she'd have to look into the exact number, but that the station had been operational in its current capacity for about 12 years. I thought about the handwriting in the logbook. Small, clean, consistent across every entry. The same for 3 months of previous occupant notes, and then different for the entries that appeared after mine began. But the same as each other. All the appearing lines from night 9 forward were written by the same hand, the same small, precise instrument. 12 years, she'd said. I asked if the logbooks got archived. She said yes. The completed books got sent back to regional at the end of each occupant's tenure, and they kept them on file for 7 years per records retention policy. I thanked her and ended the call. That night, I went back and looked at the first 40 pages of the logbook again, the previous occupants' entries, and I read them more carefully than I had in October. The handwriting was neat and procedural and unremarkable, but at the end of one entry, near the end of that section, the last entry with that occupant's handwriting, there was a line I had missed on my first read. A single line at the bottom of the page, below the day's notation. It said, "You'll do fine. Pay attention to the book." I turned that page over and held it up to the light. Checked both sides. Put it back down. The handwriting on that line was small, clean. The same instrument as all the lines that had appeared in my entries. That occupant hadn't written it either. I closed the book and sat at the desk for a while. The wood stove was going. The cabin was warm. And outside, there was that heavy northern winter silence. the kind that isn't actually silent, that has its own ambient hiss and pressure. I thought about 12 years. I thought about archived logbooks. I thought about what it would mean if every book for 12 years had a handwriting in it that wasn't the occupant's. The same handwriting, all the way back. I thought about the person who occupied this station before I did, reading a line at the bottom of their last entry, and maybe sitting the way I was sitting, in this chair, at this desk, in this quiet. I made a decision then, not a dramatic one, not the kind you'd announce. I just decided that I was going to do my job well. I was going to take my readings and maintain my equipment and file my reports. And I was going to pay attention to the logbook. And I was going to drive slower on the south curve. What else is there, really? The posting extended twice. First by 3 weeks at Regional's request. Something about the next occupant's background check taking longer than expected. Then by another 2 weeks due to access road conditions. I stayed. The per diem kept accumulating. My truck got its transmission. I made a payment on the dental work. I stopped thinking of the extension as an inconvenience. The logbook entries kept appearing. Through January, through February, through the first false thaws and refreezes of early March. They were always operational, always accurate. A few times they were things I already knew, which I appreciated in a way I find hard to explain. It was like confirmation, like something checking my work and finding it acceptable. There was one night in late January when the wind was bad enough that I thought there might be structural damage to the satellite dish mount. I wrote that concern in my entry, not dramatically, just concerned about dish mount stability in sustained wind. Will inspect at first light, and the line that appeared below it said only, "It's held before. It'll hold." It held. In March, a few days before my extended posting ended, I sat down to write what I knew would be one of my last entries. The next occupant was confirmed, and their drive-in was scheduled for 4 days out. I wrote my readings, my weather notation, my equipment status. And then, below the last line of my entry, I wrote one more non-procedural line. I wrote, "I hope whoever comes next pays attention." I closed the book and went to bed. In the morning, the book was open on the desk, the way I'd been leaving it. I looked at the page. My entry was there. My final line was there. Below it, in that small, clean handwriting. "They will, if you leave the book ready." I sat down and thought about that, about what it meant, about what leaving the book ready would mean. I made my breakfast and did my morning reading at Site 1, and came back and sat at the desk again, and I wrote one more entry. The last one. Standard format, date, time, conditions, and at the end, in my own handwriting, I added a single line for whoever would come next. Pay attention to the book. I closed it and left it on the desk with my name's label facing up. The drive out was fine. The south curve was dry. I went slow anyway. I've been back at a regional office doing equipment coordination for about 4 months now. Desk job, essentially. Data entry, supply logistics, nothing in the field. I took it because I was tired, which I told myself at the time, and because the pay is decent, which is also true, but I think the real reason is something I haven't said out loud to anyone. I miss the logbook. I mean that plainly. I sit at a desk every day, and I do my work, and I file my entries into a digital system, and everything I put in stays exactly the way I put it in, and nobody adds anything, and nothing appears that I didn't write. It is completely ordinary and completely quiet, and it feels, in a way I can't fully rationalize, like a loss. I've thought about requesting another seasonal field posting. I have the seniority for it. The regional coordinator would approve it without hesitation. I know which station I would request. I know the drive in. I know the South Curve. Some nights, at my apartment, I find myself sitting at my kitchen table after dinner with a notebook in front of me. Government issue hardcover I kept from the last posting. Not the logbook itself. That one stayed with the station. A blank one. I sit and write the day's conditions. Weather, temperature, what I observed. And then I set down my pen and I wait. Nothing appears. Of course, nothing appears. But I keep waiting anyway. I think that's the most honest thing I can tell you about what this did to me. Not that I'm afraid. Not that I'm haunted in any dramatic sense. Just that I learned to expect something. In a specific silence, at a specific kind of desk, at a specific hour. And now, ordinary silence doesn't feel complete. It just feels like waiting for something that isn't coming. Not yet.